Hello, it's Blue coming to you live from the Hollywood Glacier in Iceland. Today, we are going to do a good old fashioned box opening, since I don't believe I have done one yet for the Trial by Frost set. And as you will see, this is actually the last box I have of the case I got for Season 2. So we are looking for the God Pack we still have not hit yet. Uh, I'm sorry, what? There's no. I have to wait till maybe set 4? Well, anyway, like I was saying, we are opening this final box of Trial by Frost in hopes of just some sweet uniques, not any non existent god packs, as well as filling out the rares in my playset, as my common collection is already so massive that I'm using them for practice when I get Gambit like powers one day.
You know how long I've been waiting for this? Woo, I'm about to make a name for myself here.
Shout out to Channing Tatum in that accent. So, without any further delay or random asides, let's open some packs and fast forward or skip through the boring parts. Also, please subscribe. Thank you. Okay, so we have the first unique of the box. It is a Snoozer Shroom in the Ortis Out of Faction, and it has a 4/3/3 stat line, 3 cost from hand, 3 cost from reserve, and the effect is when another character joins my expedition, if you control 2 or more landmarks, create an Ortis recruit soldier token in your other expedition. And the support ability is target character you control with hand cost 4 or less gains a sleep. Almost so good. Stat line is good just for a standard card, and if it had had the other standard token generator effect without that landmark restriction, especially a double landmark restriction, this would have been a pretty cool first unique pull. Overall, though, with all the other competition going on in my decks at the moment, especially for Ortis, I can't see with the current meta this being super useful, especially with that double landmark setup. This would be more something that would work better if I was playing Sierra or the like, but otherwise a really good card, especially for 3 cost. It's just that darn landmark restriction kind of hobbles it a little bit. But yeah, overall, I wouldn't rate it too high, but it's definitely not the worst, especially if you're just trying to find a card with solid stats, and if you want to try to build around landmarks, you definitely could. So yeah, there you go. And it looks like we have our second unique, another Ortis setup, and we're only just a few packs in, so hopefully the second half of the box won't be too boring. It is a Snow Maiden, 5 cost from hand, 3 cost from reserve, 4/4/5 in stats, 2 hand effects, and the effects are, unless you control 2 or more landmarks, target opponent may exhausted resupply, and then if my expedition is behind characters you control, gain 1 boost. Again, the landmarks condition, at least at this point in the game as far as Altered is concerned, is not the most ideal. The card in of itself I don't think is a bad one. 4/4/5 in stats, especially when played from reserve, is solid. And realistically, even for 5 costs from hand and having enough characters out to utilize that charge hand effect, is still a good amount of stats for anyone to have to deal with in any type of Ortis deck, especially one that has a good amount of tokens. So again, not the highest tier of Ortis setup here, but still one that I think is quite solid. Just would be, at this point, hard to find a spot for it in my current Ortis deck list, but definitely something to look at in the future. hopefully when these landmarks restrictions aren't quite too hard, especially the double ones. I've had both of these now that are double landmark restrictions that are not the most ideal at the moment. All right, we got another unique here, this time in the Vishvakarma, and a whole bunch of text, if you can read it. 6 from hand, 4 from reserve, axiom, infection, 3, 4, 3 in stats, and then a from anywhere effect. If your reserve is empty, rather, the next permanent you play this afternoon costs 3 less. And then from reserve, if there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, you may discard target permanent. And then when I go to the reserve from the expedition zone, if there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, create a brass bug 2/2/2 robot token in your companion expedition. Obviously, I think this is pretty centered around if you can play some type of Nilum Tree Axiom deck. Usually we're seeing that in Sierra at the moment. Still a good amount as far as like 6 costs to play from hand in order to do this. I think this is ideally something that if you have something that puts from your hand to reserve, like a Keylon Elemental, a Unique, or even the Ouroboros Slayer Bastion, that you can play just once from reserve. You do lose out of that third effect of being able to create a Brass Bug, but I don't know if it's necessarily worth it. Because essentially it would be 5/6/5 in that scenario, but you have to have 2 or more exhausted cards done at that point, which may be difficult if you're paying 6 costs for this. This does allow you to play a permanent for less, 3 less, which is technically a free permanent in some cases, but only if your reserve is empty. So a lot of restrictions on this. I don't know if I could see this being used, especially with how prevalent some Axiom Uniques can get. Probably on the lower end of the cards I've seen thus far, but at least it doesn't have the landmark restrictions that we've seen from the 2 Ortis setups. But yeah, cool card, nice wall of text. All right, so we have our 4th unique in the flawed prototype. Again, why am I covering that up as if I'm not going to have this scanned by the time I post this? Yeah, flawed prototype, Muna out of faction, 5/5 hand reserve, 2 anywhere effects, 7/5/7 in stats, so quite a beefy boy. And the 2 effects are sacrifice a plant or permanent. If you can't, target opponent draws a card. And then also, if you control 2 or more boosted characters, you may send target character to reserve. And honestly, of the cards that I've pulled thus far in this box, I feel like this is probably the best. It has a lot of stats. The first effect of sacrificing a plant or a permanent just kind of comes standard with flawed prototype. But in the case of you only having to let your opponent draw a card, not too horrible, because most of the time you have to sacrifice itself. And there's some small plant and or prototypes permanents that you can get rid of in Muna decks these days if you want to. I feel like a floral tint or something along those lines wouldn't be too bad, or even a smaller sneezer shroom that you're not sneezer shroom, I guess sneezer shroom, or even a spindle harvesters. Especially for 7/5/7 stats, and if you really don't want your opponent to draw a card. And then the secondary effect of controlling 2 or more boosted characters to send a target character to reserve isn't that hard to accomplish in any Muna deck, I'd have to imagine, and it's essentially a Dorothy Gale effect from anywhere, a rare Dorothy Gale effect for a lot more stats. So yeah, probably my favorite thus far, and something I could definitely take a look at if I ever decided to actually like Muna. There we go. All right, 3 packs left to try that, hit that ever infamous 5th unique to get an above average day. And we'll see how it goes. All right, we do have another unique, the 5th unique of this box. So good to see that. We still have 1 pack left. Unlikely to hit another unique, but who knows? We might get super lucky with the 6. But either way, we got a Belasenka in faction, Ysmir. 5 cost from hand, 2 cost from reserve, and it is a 2/2/3 in stats. From anywhere, if there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, create a Manamoth Illusion token in your companion expedition, and then from reserve, you may exhaust target card in reserve. It's not one of those crazy Belasenkas that we've seen before that seem to be the prizes of the Trial by Frost set, but it's also not horrible. You get the from anywhere effect, but it's behind the double exhausted, and unfortunately the secondary effect of you may exhaust a target card in reserve isn't an anywhere effect to help you out with that, so not the most ideal situation. It is nice because you get the 2 cost good stats, being able to create a Manamoth potentially and exhaust a card, but other than that, it seems pretty conditional. Better than some of the ones that we've gotten thus far, but definitely not the best in my opinion, but solid card nonetheless, and always cool to see the potential hope of a Belasenka unique and getting that dashed immediately, that it's not a multi-$100 card. But yeah, probably the last unique. We'll see what this last pack has to say. That was the last unique. Interestingly enough, we got no unique foilers either. I didn't read anything as far as the drop rates on those, if those went down, but I've had that happen multiple times at this point. But let's go ahead and take a look at the pulls as far as uniques, do a quick review on everything. We'll start with our first one, the Snoozer Shroom that was almost amazing. Would have been solid stats for 3 cost and the token generator, but unfortunately it has the landmark restriction, which may not be a big deal in future sets, but for now it is not the most ideal situation, especially with 2 landmarks being the restriction. It does have the typical Snoozer Shroom support ability, which isn't bad either, but at the moment I can't see it being used too highly. Let's go ahead and throw these down as far as like my personal rankings, and I'll put it down in the middle for now, and we'll see where it ends up. Next one is the Snow Maiden, which, as I mentioned as well, also has that double landmark restriction rather. It does have a decent amount of stats if you're able to play it from reserve, and being able to boost all your characters in a little bit of a charge type of way, especially since we're not seeing charge in a lot of decks these days, isn't a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, not too bad. I think I prefer the Snoozer Shroom over the Maiden though, so I'm going to keep it behind the Snoozer Shroom as far as my rankings on these uniques. Next up is the Vishvakarma in the Axiom setup here. A lot of text to work with, but essentially we get some stats. We get to reduce the permanent cost if your reserve is empty from anywhere. From reserve, you can also discard a target permanent. If you have 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, you or your opponent. And when I go to the reserve from the expedition zone, if there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, create a brass bug token in your companion expedition. Yeah, definitely doable. I just don't see it very often that you're going to want to use this in a Axiom deck with these types of conditions unless we see something later on, especially if you want cost reduction. You can still use a Vishvakarma and it doesn't have that restriction necessarily. Overall though, it's not a horrible card, just the one I can't be seeing used too much. Would have been nice if it had a support ability, especially in a Axiom deck where we can see those being used a lot. Especially to the point of activating anywhere effects, but not this case. I'm going to go ahead and put it 3rd at the moment, behind both the Snoozer Shroom and the Snow Maiden. Next one is our fourth unique. It is the flawed prototype in the Muna setup. A lot of stats, has the typical you have to sacrifice something as a flawed prototype, but in this case your opponent just draws a card, which you can work to your advantage sometimes in Muna decks. People haven't been using that a lot, but definitely doable. And if you control two or more boosted characters, you may send target character to reserve. Anytime you have any type of removal, it is solid, especially with this amount of stats and being 5 costs. I think it's solid. Granted, I don't play a lot of Muna, but I feel like in comparison to the other cards, I'm going to go ahead and rank this numero uno at the moment, and we'll take a look at the final Belasenka. Last unique that we have seen most recently is this Belasenka. No, it is not one of the double exhaust Belasenkas. No, it doesn't do anything with that double exhaust, but it does let you create a mana moth if you have 2 or more exhausted characters in reserve, cards in reserve, not characters. And it has to go to the companion expedition. And then from reserve, you may exhaust target character in reserve for only 2 costs, which is not bad. It has a nice 2/2/3 stat line that's a little bit more even than your standard Belasenka, and I don't think we talked about it, but the reserve ability or the support ability of exhausted resupply isn't bad either. Again, a little bit of setup that you have to get the ideal for this, and 5 costs from hand isn't the best, especially since all it does is create a mana moth in a specific expedition, and you already have to have 2 exhausted cards in the reserve, and you may not have enough mana to make that happen unless you have cards already in reserve that are exhausted, which I don't think many people are playing Snow Queen at the moment. So yeah, not the best. As far as where I'd place it at the moment, um, let's say I actually like the Snow Maiden more. I think this may just be my Ordis bias showing here, but I'm gonna go ahead and place it fourth, and this will be the final lineup as far as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the uniques. A good box overall, though. Got 5 uniques, a little bit above average, and we love being above average in this house. And yeah, that's all there is to it. Solid joke, Blue. Thank you everyone for taking a look at this video once again, especially making it all the way to the end. Please do the like, comment, subscribe thing so I can continue to inflate my ego, and I'll see you in play on the next day.